Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of Eagle Productions' Hope Derek, your podcast to have hope for the United States. We can overcome every single problem. Last week, I promised you that we'll do a deep dive into tariffs this week. And right now, this week, we're going to do that. President Donald J. Trump announced on April 2nd, 2025, in the Rose Garden of the White House, that over 90 countries were taking advantage of the United States with unfair tariffs, or in other words, unfair tax rates. Let's do a deep dive into that. Were the numbers that President Trump announced on April 2nd accurate? We'll look at three countries in particular: Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. President Donald J. Trump announced that Vietnam was charging the United States 90%, and that Indonesia was charging around 75%, and Malaysia was charging around 47%. According to the World Trade Organization, and I get these numbers from a Ben Shapiro podcast, the actual numbers are that Vietnam is charging around 9.4%, Indonesia is charging around 7.6%, and Malaysia is charging around 5.6%. Therefore, the numbers that President Trump announced are actually false. They're not accurate. However, we still commend President Trump. At least I'll speak for myself, I still commend President Trump for tackling this. In the last episode, we quoted Bill Ackman. He is a hedge fund manager of Pershing Square Capital Management. And he said that the country is behind President Trump in fixing, quote, a global system of trade that has disadvantaged the country, close quote. Therefore, President Trump is right in tackling this and trying to make this a fair deal, where that the United States is not at a disadvantage to international trade and international taxes. However, the numbers he announced do not match what the World Trade Organization actually reports, and that is a concern. However, there is a 90-day pause on these tariffs, and going off of an article from CBS News that was written by Amy Peakey, edited by Anne Marie D. Lee on April 9th, 2025, that the United States reciprocal tariffs are on imports from about 90 nations, as we know. And right now, there's a 10% across the board tariff proposed by the president. Now, there's a 90-day pause, so these tariffs are not going to go into effect. And after the 90-day pause from this article, stocks soared. S&P 500 gained 8.4% as of when this article was written on April 9th. Dow Jones Industrial Average surged 7%. These are records. The stock market rose. With that said, experts in the finance field, now I don't always believe experts in certain fields, claim that the volatility of the stock market is a concern because investors want confidence in giving numbers. Like, for example, think about a car. If you're going to invest in a car that you want to drive, a car that you're confident is going to reliably get from point A to point B, that's going to give you more peace and assurance as opposed to a car that may look nice, but you're not sure if it's going to last. Similar with investors and the world economy. Investors, they want stability and confidence, and what President Trump is doing is not that. But as Bill Ackman, who is the aforementioned CEO, there is a problem. The country has been disadvantaged. And as an example to provide supporting evidence, I'm going to go to law school. When we make a statement in law, I have to provide supportive evidence. And again from CBS News, that the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, was signed on December 17, 1992. Now, that date, December 17, 1992, that's from the U.S. Congressional Government website. President Bill Clinton and at the time the leaders of Mexico and Canada signed. As a result, a CBS article written by Laura Doan and Julia Ingram on April 8, 2025 from CBS News reported that NAFTA cost the United States, at the very least, 4.5 million manufacturing jobs. And that was from a study done by the Economic Policy Institute, which is, as they reported, a, quote, left-leaning think tank, close quote. Basically, a left-leaning idea forum. Kind of like this podcast, where we're a think tank, we're going to propose ideas and hope. The Economic Policy Institute, they do the same thing. They have an agreement with people that are more on the left side of things. I agree with some things on the left, not all, and I agree with a lot of things that Republicans advocate for, but not all. But I wouldn't consider myself left-leaning, so I respect this Economic Policy Institute, and I'm quoting them as a sign of respect in this podcast, but there are a number of things we don't agree on, but I will treat them with respect. And what we do agree on is that millions of jobs in the United States have been lost, manufacturing jobs from NAFTA. Another interesting statistic is that between 1997 and 2018, the same institute reported that 91,000 manufacturing establishments were lost. President Trump on April 2nd, Liberation Day, said 90,000. In fact, this CBS article and this left-leaning think tank thinks Donald Trump is actually being conservative in that estimate, that he actually is being too low. 91,000. With that said, when the census was done in 2020, the Census Bureau, that same institute, said actually 70,500 manufacturing establishments were lost. The bottom line is innumerable jobs have been lost from unfair trade agreements, and also tens of thousands of manufacturing establishments. At the very least, 70,500 have been lost. Therefore, in this deep dive on tariffs, President Donald J. Trump, even though he's wrong in the numbers that he proposed on April 2nd, 2025, according, in my opinion, are false. They don't line up with the World Trade Organization. He is accurate, as the aforementioned CEO, Bill Ackman, noted. The United States has a problem. We've lost millions of jobs. Tens of thousands of manufacturing establishments have been lost. So I commend President Trump for tackling this. He's right on the tariffs. I would appreciate it if he was more accurate on the numbers he presented, but other than that, I'm with him 1,000% in trying to even out this trade. We can't lose millions of manufacturing jobs. We can't lose tens of thousands of manufacturing establishments. That's not okay. And I commend President Trump for tackling this. Incidentally, the reciprocal tariffs, that's what President Trump is proposing on Liberation Day. And what President Trump described as reciprocal tariffs, he said, quote, "They do it to us and we do it to them," close quote. That's what President Trump said on April 2nd. Meaning if they tax us, we'll tax them. These reciprocal tariffs were set to go into force at 12:01 a.m. on April 9th, 2025. And that's according to the article from CBS News written by Amy Peckey and edited by Anne-Marie D. Lee. Now, he postponed it 90 days. Therefore, they are now set to go forward on July 8th, 2025. And this 90-day pause has had a record, U.S.-setting record of the stocks rising. With that said, the volatility is concerning to the investors, as we noted earlier, and that the numbers President Trump reported are not accurate. However, the substance and ideology that he's going after this, that is accurate. Thank you for joining episode 2. Thank you for having hope for the United States. We can solve this. We can solve the $30 trillion in debt, and we can solve every problem we're facing. There's hope for America, and there's hope for you, and there's hope for me. There's hope for all of us. We can do this.